The Italian invasion of Egypt commenced on September 9, 1940, when the Italian 10th Army under Marshal Rodolfo Graziani advanced from Italian Libya along the Egyptian coast toward the Suez Canal. The initial plan was ambitious, seeking a major thrust into Egypt to defeat British forces and seize the canal. However, the objective was scaled down to an advance as far as Sidi Barrani, about 65 miles into Egypt, due to logistical challenges. The 10th Army, composed mostly of non-motorised infantry divisions and supported by limited armoured units like the Meleti Group, was to consolidate its position at Sidi Barrani and prepare for further advances. The Italians faced significant weaknesses in their planning and logistics. Their supply lines were extended and vulnerable. Supplies had to be shipped from Italy to ports far west in North Africa, such as Tripoli and Benghazi, then trucked hundreds of miles to the front. This strain was made worse by limited transport capacity, poor infrastructure, and harsh desert conditions that caused mechanical breakdowns and heavy fuel consumption. Trucks having to use vast amounts of fuel just to reach forward troops. The British targeted the coastal roads, attempting to disrupt the supply lines to the Italian army, an army relying on transport from roads stretching from Benghazi and Tobruk. Not all supplies could reach the front lines in time, with units often lacking spare parts and ammunition, as well as fuel, water and food. The Italians lacked sufficient lorries and transport aircraft, which severely restricted their operational mobility. Additionally, their armoured forces were hampered by a lack of tanks and limited mobility, making them susceptible to rapid desert warfare that the British had honed in their armoured brigades. The advance into Egypt reached Sidi Barrani by mid-September, where the Italians halted to dig in and accumulate supplies, awaiting the completion of the Via della Vittoria, an extension of the Libyan coastal road to support further operations. The Italians had overextended their supply lines and the soldiers were exhausted. This pause ultimately exposed their static formations to British counterattacks. Graziani's decision to stop the advance at Sidi Barrani and create nearby camps put his job in jeopardy. After Graziani's halt at Sidi Barrani, Mussolini remarked after Graziani's telegram asking for more trucks, "40 days after the capture of Sidi Barrani, I ask myself the question, to whom has this long halt been any use, to us or to the enemy? I do not hesitate to answer, it has been of use, indeed, more to the enemy. It is time to ask whether you feel you wish to continue in command." Shortly after, the British devised Operation Compass, that would see the British Western Desert Force, though numerically inferior, use well-drilled combined arms tactics, mobility and coordination during December 1940, decisively defeating the Italian 10th Army at Sidi Barrani and the surrounding camps built by Graziani and 10th Army commander Mario Berti. The destruction of the Italian camps around Sidi Barrani during Operation Compass in December 1940 was a decisive British victory. The British and Commonwealth forces launched a surprise attack on December 9, 1940, starting with the assault on the fortified Italian camp at Nibewa, which was held by the Meleti Group. The camp was quickly overrun after a coordinated infantry and tank attack, resulting in the death of the Italian commander Meleti and the capture of around 2,000 Italian soldiers and large quantities of supplies. Following this, British forces advanced on the other Italian camps around Sidi Barrani, systematically destroying them. The British armoured units exploited a gap in the Italian defences, cutting off the retreat along the coastal road. The Italians were heavily bombarded by British naval gunfire, further contributing to the collapse of their positions. By the end of the battle, around December 11th, up to 40,000 Italian and Libyan soldiers had been encircled at Sidi Barrani, facing constant bombardment and collapse of their defensive line. Several Italian infantry divisions, along with black shirt legions, armoured groups and colonial units, were effectively annihilated. British casualties were relatively light, while the Italians suffered approximately 47 officers and 2,147 soldiers killed, 2,208 wounded and 38,300 soldiers taken prisoner. The British also captured over 200 guns, 73 tanks and 1,000 vehicles. The retreat of the Italian 10th Army across Cyrenaica was a chaotic and disastrous withdrawal, following the British Operation Compass offensives that began in December 1940. Operation Compass was led by Lieutenant General Richard O'Connor, who commanded the Western Desert Force, and General Archibald Wavell, Supreme Commander of Egypt. After suffering decisive defeats at Sidi Barrani and the destruction of their fortified camps, the Italian forces were forced to retreat westward from Egypt back into Libya. The British and Commonwealth forces pursued aggressively along the coastal road, capturing key port towns and cutting off Italian escape routes. The British forces' attempt to cut off the 10th Army was thwarted somewhat by the disciplined and determined fighting of hastily organised Italian forces in Libya. These forces were led by General Annibale Bergonzoli during the defence of key locations in Cyrenaica, such as Mekili and Derna, amidst the Italian 10th Army's retreat in early 1941. Bergonzoli was known for his determined and stubborn defence, earning the nickname Barba Elettrica, meaning electric beard, for his distinctive beard and commanding presence. He had initially been ordered to defend Bardia on the coast after the British victory at Sidi Barrani and advance, receiving a message from Mussolini. "I am sure that Electric Whiskers and his brave soldiers will stand at whatever cost." Bergonzoli signalled back, "In Bardia we are, and here we stay." Under Bergonzoli's command, the Special Armoured Brigade, Brigata Carrozzata Speciale, otherwise known as the Babini Group, and the 60th Infantry Division, Sabrata, played critical roles in buying time for the retreating Italian 10th Army during its withdrawal across Cyrenaica. The Babini Group, led by Valentino Babini, was an ad hoc Italian armoured formation composed of M1340 medium tanks, Bersaglieri infantry, artillery and anti-tank guns. In late January 1941, the Babini Group was tasked with defending the strategic area between Mekili and Derna, key mountain passes and towns guarding the retreat route. Most of the Babini Group was consolidated around the Turkish fort of Mekili, while the 60th Sabrata held a defensive line in the Wadi Derna. The Babini Group mounted effective counterattacks against British armoured units and managing to delay the Australian advance on Derna. Despite communication difficulties and mechanical issues, the Babini Group's tanks inflicted considerable damage on British forces and maintained a rearguard defence around Mekili and Derna. This defensive action slowed the British pursuit and allowed more Italian forces to retreat in an organised fashion, albeit under constant pressure. Meanwhile, the 60th Sabrata Division was dug in defensively around Derna. Supported by the Babini Group, the division resisted British attempts to break its lines, contributing to the overall delay of British forces. These defensive stands were marked by fierce engagements, mines and ambushes, which further impeded the British advance. Despite the eventual fall of these positions and continued setbacks, the combined efforts of the Babini Group and the 60th Sabrata Division bought precious time for the remnants of the 10th Army to withdraw westwards toward Benghazi and beyond. Their resistance was crucial in prolonging the 10th Army's survival during the retreat across Cyrenaica. The Babini Group carried out effective withdrawals, cratering the roads, laying mines and setting booby traps, further halting British and Commonwealth advances. After the fall of Mekili and Derna, the Italian 10th Army continued its retreat westwards along the coastal road, the Via Balbia, toward Benghazi during early 1941. Despite Bergonzoli's efforts, the coastal cities, Bardia and Tobruk, also fell. The Via Balbia was the main artery of movement in Cyrenaica, and the Italian forces sought to withdraw in good order, despite constant British pressure following the successes of Operation Compass. The Babini Group, although weakened, continued to operate as a rearguard fighting unit with delaying actions along the retreat route. They used skillful ambushes, minefields and hit-and-run tactics to slow down the advancing British and Australian forces. Their tanks and Bersaglieri infantry covered the retreating formations, especially trying to slow the Australian 2nd 11th Battalion and other Commonwealth units pressing south from Benghazi toward the Italian lines. Meanwhile, the 60th Sabrata Division also fought staunchly during this phase, particularly in the mountainous terrain near the Jebel Akhdar. After disengaging from Derna, the division conducted delaying actions to protect the retreat and buy time for other units to fall back toward Benghazi. Despite their efforts, the Italian units were under constant harassing fire from the British Desert Air Force and faced logistical problems supplying fuel and ammunition along the extended lines of retreat. By late January, British intelligence confirmed the Italians were retreating rapidly along the Via Balbia. The British 7th Army Division was sent on a bold manoeuvre south of the Jebel Akhdar to intercept the Italians inland, while the Australian 6th Division continued to press along the coastal road. The Italian 10th Army's plan during the retreat along the Via Balbia involved falling back from Benghazi toward the western fortress defences around Sirte, a line prepared by the commanding forces in Tripolitania. The Via Balbia was the vital route for this retreat, spanning the Libyan coast and designed to facilitate rapid movement and supply. The Italians aimed to escape the pursuing British forces and regroup around strong defensive positions beyond Benghazi, where the 5th Army had been reinforced and defensive preparations were underway. General Giuseppe Tellera was appointed as the new commander of the 10th Army on February 3rd, 1941, after Mario Berti was relieved of the command and Marshal Rodolfo Graziani was sacked by Mussolini due to the disastrous losses and rapid collapse of Italian control in Cyrenaica. Tellera's primary task was to organise and lead the retreat of the 10th Army along the Via Balbia, salvage as many forces as possible, and establish firm defensive lines further west. Tellera was seen as a capable and decisive leader, required to manage the shattered 10th Army in a critical moment of crisis. Despite attempts to conduct an orderly withdrawal, the retreat was plagued by logistical difficulties, poor morale, and constant pressure from the relentless British and Australian pursuit. The 10th Army's objective was to reach the fortified strongholds beyond Benghazi. Tellera's appointment aimed to bring new leadership and order to the retreat, but he would experience difficult logistical challenges in the face of overwhelming British manoeuvre warfare. Tellera's primary plan and objective for the retreat was to reach the prepared defensive lines at Sirte, far to the west. He initially organised the Babini Group and 60th Sabrata for the defence of Mekili and Derna. His strategy included mounting counterattacks and harassing British flanks with the Babini Group's limited armoured forces to slow their advance and protect the pullback of the main body of the 10th Army. An example being the counter-offensive launched by the Babini Group at Fort Mekili. Tellera's objective was to maintain cohesion and an orderly retreat along the Via Balbia, relying on speed, mines and demolitions to delay the British. During the retreat of the Italian 10th Army along the Via Balbia road toward Benghazi and beyond, masses of infantry, artillery and supply convoys clogged the narrow desert highway. The movement was a slow, cumbersome procession of thousands of soldiers and hundreds of vehicles stretched out over miles along the coastal road. The convoy included large quantities of artillery pieces, ammunition trucks, fuel convoys, supply wagons, and thousands of Italian infantrymen, many exhausted and demoralised by the previous battles. The Italians hoped that they had enough speed and endurance in this long withdrawal that would allow them to evade encirclement and interception by the faster British forces. The strategy relied on maintaining momentum and orderly movement along the Via Balbia, anticipating that their logistical resources, including trucks and artillery, would sustain the retreating formations. However, the Via Balbia's limited width and the huge numbers of troops and material moving simultaneously created significant bottlenecks. These slow convoys were easy targets for British air attacks and artillery harassment. The Italian hopes for safe withdrawal were based on reaching the prepared defences at Sirte before the British could intercept. Bergonzoli, commander of the 23rd Army Corps, who had overseen key defensive operations at Mekili and Derna, also commanded forces defending important surrounding ports and roads, including the strategic coastal road Via Balbia and minor ports essential for supply and reinforcement. His responsibilities involved organising defences to delay British advances and maintain retreat routes for the 10th Army. His leadership focused on stubborn delaying actions to protect the retreat routes while holding back the British. His primary goal under Tellera's command was to preserve as much of the 10th Army as possible, buying time and space for the retreating units to reach Sirte. His plan involved a fighting retreat, slow the British advance with determined defensive stands while maintaining the cohesion of Italian forces during the long retreat across Cyrenaica. Bergonzoli understood the critical importance of the Via Balbia corridor and the nearby roads and passes to ensure the Italian army's escape. The Barbini Group, under his command, was tasked with conducting counterattacks and armoured engagements to disrupt the British pursuit and cover the withdrawal. The group's role would eventually change from a counter-attacking rearguard to an offensive frontal assault force aimed at breaking through and flanking roadblocks set up by British forces. The Barbini Group's assaults would be the best chance the 10th Army had of breaking through the roadblocks at Beda Fomm. The British strategy during Operation Compass to cut off the Italian 10th Army's retreat rather than chasing them head-on was a key manoeuvre that led to the British success. Instead of engaging in a direct frontal pursuit along the coastal road, which would have been predictable and heavily defended, the British opted for a more mobile and strategic envelopment. They exploited gaps in the Italian defensive line and used faster, lightly armoured units to move rapidly through the desert to outflank and block the Italian retreat routes. This approach aimed to trap the Italian forces, cutting them off from retreat and resupply, leading to their eventual surrender or destruction. A central element of this strategy was the deployment of Combeforce, an ad hoc flying column named after its commander, Lieutenant Colonel John Combe. Combeforce consisted of a mix of armour, artillery and motorised infantry taken from the 7th Armoured Division. Its mission was to rapidly advance ahead of the main British forces, moving south through the desert, around the difficult Jebel Akhdar mountains, towards key points on the Italian retreat line. Combeforce's plans and objectives during Operation Compass were centred on intercepting and cutting off the Italian 10th Army's retreat along the coast road in Libya. The main objective was to establish roadblocks on the Via Balbia south of Benghazi at Beda Fomm. These roadblocks were intended to ambush the retreating Italian forces by blocking their escape route and forcing them into a standstill where the British could engage and destroy them. Combeforce set up 45 positions at these blockades, supported by artillery and armoured vehicles, and prepared to repel Italian attempts to break through. The plan included infantry deployed to cover positions between the road and the sea, anti-tank guns placed strategically to counter Italian armoured assaults, and armoured cars manoeuvring in the desert to counter flanking moves. This combined use of mobile forces, artillery support and carefully selected positions allowed Combeforce to absorb attacks and disrupt Italian formations. In pursuit of the Italians along the Via Balbia was the 6th Australian Division, already having played a part in capturing key port cities along the coast, including Tobruk. The 6th Australian Division played a significant role in pursuing the retreating Italian 10th Army. After securing several key objectives, the division pressed along the Libyan coast road, maintaining constant pressure on the Italian columns as they retreated westwards toward Benghazi and beyond. Their advance along the Via Balbia was aimed at exploiting British successes, disrupting Italian movements and preventing any regrouping or effective withdrawal. This continuous pressure from the 6th Australian Division contributed to disorganising the Italian retreat and assisting in the encirclement operations that cut off many Italian units, especially in coordination with British armoured and flying columns like Combeforce. The Australians' pursuit helped ensure that the Italians could not establish stable lines of defence or make orderly withdrawals. Before this pursuit, the 6th Australian Division had captured several important ports and towns along the coast, which were strategic to controlling the region and supporting further advances. Notably, the division captured the heavily fortified Italian fortress town of Beda from January 3rd to 5th, 1941, taking about 36,000 prisoners, numerous guns, tanks and vehicles in the process. They played a key role in the capture of Tobruk on January 22nd, 1941, another crucial port further along the Via Balbia. Following Tobruk, the 6th Australian Division continued to push the Italians back deeper into Libya, contributing to the capture of ports like Derna and Benghazi during early 1941. These captures of fortified locations along the coast were integral to the Allied strategy of rolling up the Italian defences in North Africa, facilitating the advance of Commonwealth forces and tightening the noose around the retreating Italian 10th Army. The Italian 10th Army recognised the imminent danger of being trapped between two advancing Allied forces, the 6th Australian Division pushing westward along the Via Balbia from the east coast, and Combeforce manoeuvring south through the desert to cut off the Italian retreat. They were aware that the British plan involved an envelopment and encirclement manoeuvre, a classic pincer movement, with the Australians pressing down the coastal road and Combeforce establishing blocking positions further south, particularly the roadblocks near Beda Fomm. The Italians were able to interpret these Allied intentions through battlefield observations and intelligence. The risks of encirclement became apparent around late January 1941 when General Tellera ordered a counterattack at Mekili to prevent encirclement from the south, and the Bebini group engaged in efforts to disrupt the British armoured columns. Mines had been laid through the Jebel Akhdar mountain passes, where the Italians expected the British to advance. A garrison had been constructed at Skelidema, not far from Messus, in the Jebel Akhdar region. The Italians had made their preparations and knew their objectives, but did they have enough time to make it past the pursuing British mobilised forces? On the first day of the Battle of Beda Fomm, February the 5th, 1941, Combeforce arrived at the Via Balbia south of Benghazi and quickly set up roadblocks near Beda Fomm. Critically, they had got there first. The strategic move to intercept and block the retreating Italian 10th Army was on. The Combeforce had present a mix of cruiser tanks, armoured cars, motorised infantry from the 2nd Rifle Brigade, artillery units including 25-pounder field guns and anti-tank guns, and a total of about 2,000 men. By around noon, Combeforce had taken control of key terrain overlooking the Via Balbia, creating a fortified blocking position designed to ambush the approaching Italian columns. The 106th Royal Horse Artillery were positioned behind the roadblocks, armed with anti-tank guns. Not long after establishing their roadblocks, the leading elements of the Italian 10th Army appeared and immediately encountered British artillery and anti-tank fire, causing confusion and disruption within the Italian convoy. The first Italian units to encounter the British Combeforce roadblock near Beda Fomm on February the 5th, 1941 was a small convoy including Bersaglieri motorised infantry from the retreating Italian 10th Army. The Bersaglieri did not have adequate support in either artillery or tanks. More infantry attempted breakthroughs throughout the day, only to be repelled by the British, reinforced by Combeforce's 25-pounder guns and nimble armoured cars. General Combe also positioned his armoured brigades in effective ridges along the terrain surrounding the coastal road, these folds in the landscape providing extra cover and protection to the cruiser tanks. As the Italian convoys pressed towards the roadblocks, the British tanks were able to harass from the sides using their effective cover. Using hit-and-run tactics, they were able to fire and split away from the column, which sent the Italian convoys into panic. The Italians managed to send reinforcements from the north and reorganised, but the British were dug in, laying mines and able to pin down the Italians with artillery fire. The Australians were pressing hard and pressuring the rear of the Italian column. They managed to capture Barca, forcing the Italians' continued retreat to Benghazi. The Bebini group was still positioned north along the Via Balbia at this time, when Tellera ordered for a detachment of 30 M13 tanks to head south along the coastal road to attempt a breakthrough at Beda Fomm. But not all tanks could be sent south from the group. Some had to be sent to Fort Skelidema to reinforce the garrison under the command of Colonel Riccardo Bignami that was under attack earlier from Combeforce. The garrison was positioned to block off the route to the north of the Italian column and prevent the British advance, but it was failing. After the first Italian breakthrough attempt failed on February the 5th, 1941, General Giuseppe Tellera, commander of the Italian 10th Army, ordered a counterattack to break through the British roadblock at Beda Fomm on the 6th of February. This counterattack was spearheaded by the Bebini group, which had regrouped to lead the assault with their newer medium tanks, the Fiat M1340s. The M1340 tanks available that had travelled south were chosen to lead the breakthrough as they were more capable. They had more armour than anything else the Italians had at the time. Tellera's strategy hinged on breaking through the British positions to open an escape route for the 10th Army, before the Australians and British reinforcements could close the encirclement. General Bergonzoli organised the attack along the Via Balbia on the roadblocks, with the Babini Group ordered to carry out a flanking manoeuvre. The move would see the Babini Group move to the east towards a hill known as the Pimple, and from there attempt to get behind Combeforce. The British still continued their harassment of the convoys on the road, with cruiser tanks firing at vehicles and men. The British had a considerable number of tanks available from several regiments, most regiments from the 4th Armoured Brigade, the 2nd Royal Tank Regiment positioned at the Pimple, and 3rd Hussars free to attack the convoys, as well as the 7th Hussars who attacked from the north of the column. There was also the 1st Royal Tank Regiment assigned from the Reserve Corps nearby. The British tanks were either cruisers or light tanks. The 2nd Royal Tank Regiment, positioned at the Pimple, engaged with the Babini Group as the Italian tanks attacked the hill. The British Tank Regiment was armed with A-13 Mark I cruisers. The cruisers managed to inflict heavy losses on the M1340s, with 15 Italian medium tanks knocked out. The remaining tanks of the Babini Group still pressed and were supported by Italian artillery. Another Italian convoy arrived from the north, escorted by more M1340 tanks. This convoy forced back the 7th Hussars, who had been ordered to attack columns from the north. It became evident to the British forces that they had underestimated how many M1340 tanks the Italian 10th Army had, with more arriving. The tanks of the Babini Group were unable to dislodge the 2nd Royal Tank Regiment's position near a mosque on the Pimple. By noon, many M1340 tanks had been knocked out, and there were only 50 left. The British had lost tanks too. Both experienced problems, with Babini Group's communications not being the best with a lack of radios, tank commanders having to stop at pre-objectives at times to receive orders. The 2nd Royal Tank Regiment experienced fuel shortages, with tanks having to fall back to refuel. Italians received more reinforcements, with the rearguard finally arriving with more tanks and artillery. The tanks of the Babini Group continued to engage at the Pimple and, supported by artillery, were finally able to take the hill. The convoy was able to progress past the Pimple, but was still pursued doggedly by squadrons of British tanks, with Italian vehicles and men continuing to be shot down or forced to surrender. At 3 p.m. on the 6th of February, the 7th Hussars pressed an attack on the north end of the column, assisted by the 3rd Hussars from the northeast. The 3rd Hussars faced the Babini Group that had been ordered to hold its ground after pushing back the 2nd Royal Tank Regiment. Attacks continued, with the Babini Group assisting with resistance and protection for the Italian convoys. As day moved into night, Bergonzoli's plan to flank from the east was abandoned. The 2nd Royal Tank Regiment had received assistance from the 1st Royal Tank Regiment just in time to hold the Babini Group from closing in on the roadblocks. Bergonzoli's plans changed. The Babini Group was ordered to press from the west during the night. But this plan also failed, as the M13 tanks encountered fierce resistance from British artillery. The fighting was brutal, and Babini had lost many of his tanks during the day. The 4th Armoured Brigade still had 15 operational cruisers and 55 light tanks, but they were ordered to retreat back to positions closer to Combeforce around the roadblocks. Combeforce had performed an efficient job in countering organised Italian frontal assaults and artillery fire. The roadblock had held firm. Italian soldiers were trying desperately to advance and push through, darting from one direction to another, using the carcass of destroyed Italian tanks, cars and trucks as cover. But it was proving hopeless to break through Combeforce's roadblock. The Australians were pushing in from the north, having liberated Benghazi, the 19th Australian Brigade and its battalions fast approaching to the Italians' rear. They were sent in by High Command, British Lieutenant General Richard O'Connor giving the order to General Mackay of the 6th Australian Division to send in 2 battalions of infantry to attack the rear of the Italian column south of Benghazi. The Italian column of convoys were now in a desperate situation on the Via Balbia, unable to penetrate through the British roadblocks up ahead, and now facing encirclement from Commonwealth forces closing in. The crews of the remaining Italian tanks, those that had fought hard under General Valentino Babini, had decided to fully back a new plan, one that would involve General Tellera on the front lines of combat. On February the 7th, 1941, General Giuseppe Tellera, commander of the Italian 10th Army, along with General Bergonzoli, planned a final desperate frontal assault on the British roadblock at Beda Fomm with the remaining 30 M1340 medium tanks. Tellera personally chose to lead this last-ditch attack by riding into battle in one of the M13 tanks himself. This charge was aimed at breaking through the British positions that had blocked the Italian retreat on the Via Balbia. Despite the earlier failed attempts and heavy losses, Tellera's plan reflected a last effort to punch through the roadblock and allow the remnants of his forces to escape encirclement. The attack involved the Babini Group's surviving M1340 tanks spearheading the assault, supported by whatever infantry and artillery the Italians could muster. The British defenders, well dug in and supported by artillery and anti-tank weapons, fiercely resisted the attack. The engagement produced intense fighting with repeated Italian armoured charges, but they were ultimately repulsed. The M13 tanks managed to advance as far as the British 2nd Rifle Brigade officers' mess tent, located near the defensive positions. They successfully knocked out all but one of the British anti-tank guns initially and pushed into the reserve company area of the British defences. Despite these significant gains and the destruction of British artillery positions, the Italian tanks were unable to break the overall roadblock. British tank crews and infantry reopened fire, and other British armoured units manoeuvred to contain and counter the assault. General Tellera was found mortally wounded in one of the disabled M13 tanks after this action and died in hospital the following day. His leadership and personal bravery were recognised posthumously with Italy's Gold Medal of Military Valour. There was a line of destroyed or abandoned vehicles and equipment that stretched for miles along the coastal road from Beda Fomm. Abandoned lorries, guns and tanks. The Allies managed to take 25,000 prisoners, including Generals Babini, Bergonzoli and Tellera shortly before he died. A written statement from Lieutenant General Richard O'Connor. This may be upsetting for some viewers. Broken up and overturned lorries, in some places guns, lorries and tanks in hopeless confusion. Elsewhere guns in action and broken down M13s. All over the countryside and everywhere masses of prisoners. Most of the enemy tanks had dead men inside them. General Tellera, the army commander, was in one lying seriously wounded. He died later in the day. The British and Commonwealth forces lauded the victory, but it still came at a cost. The Battle of Beda Fomm and other battles that preceded it cost the British and Commonwealth forces in tanks, vehicles, repairs, fuel and ammunition, and the men were physically exhausted. It stretched Allied resources considerably more than they would have first thought, having pushed the Italians out of Egypt relatively easily. The advance was ordered to a halt by Winston Churchill after Beda Fomm, instead redeploying some British forces to Greece with an expected attack from the Germans in the Balkans. The Babini Group became something of a symbol of resistance after the battle, tank crews that fought fiercely in an ultimately futile breakthrough attempt. Despite several valiant attacks, the Babini Group faced overwhelming British artillery, anti-tank guns and armoured vehicles. Their efforts to break through the British blockades failed. Combeforce's ambush created chaos and confusion, and many Italian tanks and vehicles were destroyed or captured. The Babini Group's sacrifice is remembered as a hard-fought last stand in difficult circumstances, symbolising both tactical adversity and the bravery of Italian troops in the Western Desert Campaign. The reaction at home in Italy and Rome to the crushing defeat at the Battle of Beda Fomm was one of shock, disappointment and increasing concern. The loss of the Italian 10th Army, including around 25,000 prisoners, around 100 tanks still serviceable, artillery pieces and vehicles, represented a catastrophic blow to Mussolini's ambitions in North Africa and damaged his regime's prestige. The Italian public and leadership were deeply unsettled by the scale of the defeat and the failure to effectively counter the rapidly advancing British forces. This defeat exposed the weaknesses of the Italian military effort in North Africa, the inability of the Babini Group and the wider 10th Army to stop the British ambush and subsequent surrender highlighted the limitations of Italy's campaign. The political and military fallout created pressure on Mussolini and the fascist regime. As a direct consequence of the disaster at Beda Fomm and the subsequent surrender of Italian forces, Mussolini was forced to request substantial military assistance from Adolf Hitler's Germany. This request marked a turning point where Italian dependency on German support increased substantially, eventually leading to the deployment of the Afrika Korps under General Erwin Rommel to bolster Axis efforts in North Africa. The German intervention was aimed at shoring up the failing Italian campaign and preserving Axis strategic interests in the Mediterranean region. The Battle of Beda Fomm marks both the tragic collapse of the Italian forces in North Africa and a pivotal moment that set the stage for a reinvigorated Axis presence in the Desert War. The battle resulted in the near-total destruction and surrender of the Italian 10th Army, exposing serious weaknesses in Italian military equipment, tactics and command. The defeat severely damaged Italian hopes of controlling Cyrenaica and highlighted the urgent need for a strategic and material boost. Erwin Rommel and the Afrika Korps had deployed shortly after the catastrophe at Beda Fomm, arriving in Libya on February 12, 1941. However, German intervention alone was not the only factor in the prolonged desert campaign. Following Operation Compass, Italy also significantly improved its armoured and motorised divisions. Notably, the arrival of the 132nd Armoured Division Arietta and other reformed Italian units in 1941 brought more modern tanks, motorised infantry and better trained armoured formations to North Africa. These enhanced Italian divisions fought alongside the Germans in subsequent battles, demonstrating improved effectiveness in mobile warfare, such as the Battle of Bir el Gubi during Operation Crusader. The joint strength of German armoured tactics with upgraded Italian forces extended the intensity and duration of the Desert War, as both Axis armies were able to mount significant counter-offensives and defensive operations. Thus, Beda Fomm represents not only the collapse of Italy's initial war effort in North Africa, but also the catalyst for a deeper Axis commitment, combining German tactical expertise with newly reinforced Italian armoured and motorised divisions. This blend prolonged the desert conflict by transforming it into a more formidable and balanced struggle, shaping the course of the North African campaign until May 1943.